Hi there. Welcome to another edition of Your Long Range Plan. And as always, with me is Paul Tanney. He's an elder law attorney from Quincy, as well as a CPA. And I always say this, but I'll say it again, and he practices down here on the Cape in Sandwich with me. My name's John Kennan, and I too practice in the realm of elder law. I'm not a CPA. I depend on Paul for that expertise. And Paul, welcome again.
Thank you.
And I think today we should talk about reasons for having a trust. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Why should one have a trust?
The answer is it depends. Not everybody has to have a trust. And we've talked about before with estate planning, we do have some what I call the no-brainer documents that people should have, and we've talked about this before. Everybody should have, I don't care who you are, healthcare proxies, durable power of attorneys, wills. But should you have a trust? Kind of depends. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You don't need to have a trust, but depends on your facts and circumstances, your asset situation, and what you're trying to accomplish. But some of the reasons why people would want to have a trust, one would be to avoid the probate process, to make it smoother, to get the assets to the next generation down after you pass away, or for ease of management if one were to become disabled. So that usually we like to have our clients in control of their own financial situation. So if they're utilizing a trust, then they would be the trustee. The trustee is the person who's in control of the management of the assets of the trust. Now the trustee has a fiduciary duty to carry out the language of the trust. That's their duty, that's their mandate, so to speak. So typically if we're dealing with a couple or an individual, we want them to be their own trustee. Okay, and their job as the trustee is to benefit usually themselves as the beneficiary. So that will go for a period of time, usually their lifetime, and then after that the trust still continues. So unlike an individual, a trust doesn't end at death. The trust typically continues, but again, it depends on what the people are trying to accomplish. It could end shortly after the elder's death. Depends on what they're trying to do. If all they want to do is to just make it easier to get to the next generation, and they want it to basically, wrap up their affairs, pay their last debts and expenses, and then just pay out to their beneficiaries, then their trust can say that. That's typically what we call a probate avoidance trust. But another reason would be if you had a married couple and you're trying to take advantage of some of the estate tax laws. Usually with a married couple, you want to benefit one another first, okay, and even the survivor, and then ultimately the children or other beneficiaries. But how can we do that in such a way that we're taking advantage of some of the estate tax laws? Well, the easiest way to do that is with a trust. And like I said earlier, depends on everybody's facts and circumstances, but the trust can end after the couple's lifetime or after the individual's lifetime and then be paid out to the beneficiaries, the children, the grandchildren, depending on how it's set up. Or the trust can continue. And I know sometimes some of our kids aren't good at managing money. They're lousy with money. Or sometimes clients don't particularly trust a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law. And if they feel that their inheritance going directly to those kids, their children, is going to be eaten up by a future divorce or just a lousy situation, or just if those particular beneficiaries aren't good at managing money, well then they can have their trust created so that it continues during the lifetime of their child. So you can get pretty creative with trusts, and that's what makes it interesting from my perspective, from an estate planning perspective.
Let's go back to probate avoidance. Let's talk about that specifically. How does one avoid, we both know the answer to the question, but how does one avoid probate with a trust? For example, you and I will create trusts, we'll counsel our clients to fund the trust. And we have spoken about this in the past, I know, but it's key that we revisit this issue. The trust, to avoid probate, has to be funded. Otherwise, the assets will pass through an estate.
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk about funding the trust or retitling assets. What kind of assets does one retitle into a trust?
Well, again, everybody's situation is a little bit different, but if the goal is to, say, avoid the probate process, to streamline things so that it's the second generation is taking over immediately at, say, the death of the parents, then we want to make sure that trust is funded during lifetime. And you're right, what do we mean by funded? If it's real estate, if we want to get their residence into the trust, then we have to do a deed from the individual to the individual as the trustee of their trust. So we have to do a deed and get that deed recorded at the Registry of Deeds. So we have to record a new deed going from the individual to the trustee of the trust, and we also have to record either the full trust document or a trust certificate, which is typically what they do. A trust certificate now is something that was created, or a law that was passed maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it allows you to not have to record the whole trust, but just kind of a synopsis of the trust, who the trustees are, when the trust ends, the power clauses that the trustees would have, so kind of like a bare bones synopsis of the trust. So that's how we would fund the trust with real estate. If you had a bank account, now to fund the trust with the bank account, again, that's up to the client. That's up to the individual. They have to take their trust document and bring that to the bank and say, hey, I need to retitle my savings account or checking account or money market account. I need to retitle that into the name of my trust. So usually the customer service rep at the bank will take either a copy of the whole trust or just a copy of the signature page in the title page, and they'll draw up a new account in the name of the trust so that when the client gets their next bank statements, it's going to have their name, trust on it. And that's how you fund a trust with a bank account or a CD or a money market account. Same thing with a brokerage account.
I was just going to ask.
You'd have to meet with your financial planner or your brokerage account rep and state to the brokerage account rep that you need to retitle that account from being individually or jointly held to being held in the name of the trust. Again, it's paperwork. It doesn't create a new taxable event by funding the trust, but the next time you get a brokerage account statement, it will say the name of the trust on it with your list of securities or mutual funds or whatever you have in your brokerage account. So that's how you would fund the trust with a brokerage account.
And all those assets that we're funding the trust with would pass outside or be a non-issue in terms of probate with the probate courts.
Correct.
It's a private matter between the family members, the trustee, the beneficiaries, and what have you.
Right, because don't forget, a trust is where you create your own rules as to how you want things managed, during your lifetime and after your lifetime. So as long as you're competent when you're signing the trust, when you're executing the trust, that's the key factor. As long as you're competent and can execute that, and you want to get it funded too, then that's the big requirement for getting a trust put into force.
And again, any of those assets that are not put in trust would be subject to probate. So,
well, we have to take a look at the asset themselves, because don't forget,
there's life insurance, IRAs,
and again, the nature of those type of assets are they pass via the beneficiary designation.
Outside of an estate, outside of the trust, unless, go ahead.
Unless the individual had not filled out a beneficiary form. And if you die owning a life insurance policy and you hadn't filled out who the beneficiary is, then at death, the life insurance company has to make that payable to your estate. That means your will is going to operate on how those proceeds get dispersed. So another way of funding a trust with life insurance would be to get a change of beneficiary form and name the trust as the beneficiary of the life insurance. So that way, when the person passes away, the insured, their trust would be getting the check from the life insurance company. So you'd be funding that trust after death by having filled out the change of beneficiary form that makes it payable directly to the trust. So yes, that's very key. If you're going to have a trust, then you want to make sure that it's funded during your lifetime. Now, typically your trust, when we're putting an estate plan together, the will have a provision that says, hey, if the trust hadn't been funded with all of the assets, for whatever reason, there'll be a pour-over provision from the will that pours it into the trust. But again, it depends on what the client's trying to accomplish. The client may say, hey, I'm just going to fund the trust with the assets that I want, but the other assets, maybe the client wants those to pass via the will. Usually not, but sometimes that may be the case. Or sometimes the client may say, hey, I'm going to have my other assets that aren't in the trust set up jointly because I want them to pass to those particular people directly. So that's another way of accomplishing that.
I know we're talking about trust, but twice you've mentioned jointly held property. Just for the sake of the viewers, the listeners, let's talk about, briefly, the advantages and disadvantages of jointly held property. The clarity that's needed in terms of why, for instance, I open up a bank account, I want you to be a joint account holder, I pass away. Why did we have the joint bank account? Was it for convenience only? Or did I truly want you to benefit by whatever was in that bank account by operation of law? So I'd like to hear from you on that.
Yeah, very important. If it's jointly held, then that means at death, the joint account holder, the survivor, is going to be the owner of that account. So many times people will set up joint accounts with, say, their in-town child, but they have 3 children. And their real goal is to have their estate divided equally when they're gone. Well, then that's a danger. If you have an account that's set up jointly with a child, a lot of times that's for convenience purposes. Now, if you pass away and that money, that joint account is going to be now controlled by the surviving child, is that what you want? Is that surviving child going to share that with the other 2 siblings? Legally, they don't have to. So that can be a danger. And again, how you would avoid that being a problem is if it was funded in your trust during lifetime. And that way the trust will say, if you want it to be split equally with the kids, that, hey, after I pass away, pay off debts, expenses, taxes, and whatever's left over, pay that out to my children equally. Well, that way, if your checking account or savings account is already in the trust, that's crystal clear. But if it's held jointly with the in-town child and 2 other children are out of town, or just, they may be around, but you have one child who kind of helps out more than the other, just be aware that, that could be a problem.
I think front and center for this discussion is the need to communicate to everyone the difference between a revocable or living trust and an irrevocable trust, and what each one means, the advantages and disadvantages because of a lack of definition by an attorney or someone. Without disparaging or saying the wrong thing, we all pick up the newspapers, we hear people talk about these seminars, like the ones we do, the workshops. Come and listen to John and Paul talk about the advantages of an asset protection trust. Avoid mass health liens, avoid taxes. It's overwhelming. So how would you, we've only got a few minutes during these shows, but how do you handle, an issue like that? How do you explain to somebody, when posed with the question, what do I do? I'm hearing all this unbelievable information that I need to know, or I'm supposed to know, but I don't know.
Right. Well, I think the easiest thing to do is to come to a workshop and kind of sit down for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and kind of go through the gamut of the different techniques and things that are out there. You want to become educated first. But sometimes people don't have time to do that, and that's fine too. They can come in and what I like to do is find out, what's going on with the individual, and to try to find out from them, first of all, where's their pain, or what's their issue, what are they most concerned about, and then based on the facts and circumstances, you can give them, appropriate advice. Because you're right, there's all sorts of different trusts out there. There's revocable trusts. There's trusts for taking advantage of the estate tax laws. There's asset protection trusts. There's various types of those too. There's irrevocable trusts. We used to use those a lot more when the estate tax laws were a lot different and more people were susceptible to them. With irrevocable trusts, you couldn't be your own trustee. You couldn't have an income interest, and you had to give up right to principal. So that made sense with, if somebody was definitely going to have an estate situation where they had to pay federal estate taxes, then a lot of times an irrevocable trust with a life insurance policy was a nice technique to be able to make their estate plan work. Okay, but you had to give up all sorts of control to have that type of a situation, to have that type of a plan. And a lot of times, okay, you're giving up control of a life insurance policy. So what? I mean, that really didn't disrupt your lifestyle, because the only time that life insurance policy would really come into play is if you passed away, other than paying the premiums. That, I suppose, you could look at as a disruption of your lifestyle. But a lot of times that was the more efficient way of pulling the estate plan together, so that there was liquidity to be able to have the other assets go in the direction that and benefit the family members or the beneficiaries that you wanted to benefit. So there's no, I guess, quick answer to your question, with all the different types of trusts that are out there.
Well, that's the point. So I think, my premise, or my point through you just now, is to let people know that although these seminars are very important, seminars that, or workshops that folks or individuals like Paul and I put on, and others when you see them in the newspaper, don't forget, everyone has their own needs.
Right.
Very specific needs, given their family situation, given their income, the total value of their assets, etc. So not to be overwhelmed by fear when they hear all these buzzwords.
Right.
You don't want anyone to take your home if you get sick. You don't want anyone to take your loved one's hard-earned money. Just that's not appropriate. You and I don't operate like that. We don't like to frighten anyone. We like to garner as much information as possible, so we're educated, so we can impart the right information.
But I think by the same token, it is important to find out what's out there.
Right.
And I think a lot of times when people are having those type of workshops, like we do, it's not to really frighten people, but it's more to encourage people to get educated. Find out what's out there. I mean, I've had plenty of people come to some of my workshops. We've talked about all sorts of different things and techniques and estate plans and estate planning ideas, and then come to find out that once they've digested that, once they've really thought it over, I mean, they've elected to go with a relatively simple estate plan. And hey, that's fine. I feel that I've done my job, because again, it's not we're not trying to say to hey, everybody should have an asset protection trust, or everybody should have a revocable trust. It really depends on the particular client, what's important to them. And I like to find that out, and then based on their facts and circumstances, and again, what's important to them, then I can kind of guide them and give them some choices and show them what some of the potential solutions are for their estate plan. But ultimately, it's up to the client to again, get educated, find out what is out there, and how that pertains to their situation.
For example, off the top of my head, someone says to us, I have a home. The home is worth, I don't know, maybe $500,000 or $600,000, hypothetically. Got $150,000 in the bank, $200,000 worth of stock that somebody left me. I just want to do everything and anything I can to save taxes. I don't want to pay taxes. How many times do you and I hear that? You know, and I guess what I'm going to look for, what I'm looking for from you is, at what point do you say, well, we all have to pay taxes, but there's a way to minimize through different vehicles, different language in the trust. Then we have a family trust provision, a marital deduction provision, et cetera. If you could comment on that. And I know it's technical. I know it requires another show just for that.
Right.
But if you could touch on that.
Well, I think what you're getting at is estate taxes.
Right.
There's various types of taxes, and a lot of times when we talk about taxes, we're talking about income taxes.
Right.
I mean, to get around income taxes, it's a hard thing to do. If you've earned income, somebody's going to pay a tax on that.
Right.
Whether it's you individually, whether it's your trust, whether it's a combination of the two, income taxes is no real getting around. Yeah, there's some certain deductions that are out there, and that's where maybe income tax planning comes into play. But I think what you're getting at is, what about estate taxes? Now, at the federal level, they've raised the federal exemption up to $5 million. So that means that when somebody passes away, as long as their estate is under $5 million, they're probably not going to be paying any federal estate taxes. If it's over $5 million, then again, you may, if it's a married couple, then you definitely want to have you know, a trust plan set up where you're taking advantage of the estate tax laws. Because if you're over that $5 million mark, you're going to be paying 35% on the overage as a federal estate tax. Now here in Massachusetts, there's also a Massachusetts estate tax. And that is going to be on a person's estate that's over the $1 million mark. So again, with a married couple, it does behoove them to sit down and do an estate plan, you know, a trust plan that takes advantage of those exemptions, because you don't know which spouse is going to pass away first, and you want to be able to be set up so that you're at least going to take full advantage of that first $1 million exemption. If everything goes to the surviving spouse at the first death, well, that's okay as far as you're not going to have to pay an estate tax at the first death, but at the second death you will, you know, because you've probably completely missed out on the exemption of the first spouse to die. And again, the way a lot of times you capture that is if you have a trust set up so that you can also benefit the surviving spouse, but in such a way that you're going to take advantage of that, you know, $1 million exemption on the death of the first spouse. So again, it gets a little technical, and again, you really see the impact on the death of the second spouse. That's where it starts to hurt. And if you haven't taken advantage of that, I mean, it's lousy, and I see it, and I try not to say, oh, you should have done this, but sometimes you see it where, okay, they're going to be paying extra estate taxes because they didn't, you know, have a trust plan set up, or they didn't fund it correctly, you know, during their lifetime.
Well, and naively, innocently, they didn't know. People purchase homes 30, 40, 50 years ago, live in them comfortably, enjoy them. It's just a function of life. The value of the home is increasing much more than they ever anticipated. People inherit homes in their names, and more often than not, people are a lot closer to that mass threshold that you're talking about than they think.
Right.
It's a lot of money. $1 million is a lot of money. I think more people than not are closer to that.
Well, again, I think it's one of those things you need to be aware of that if you are, and just get some advice. Get educated. Find out, you know, what are the laws out there? What can I do to minimize potential estate taxes?
So let me ask you a question regarding trusts and family members and so forth. Someone comes into our office, your office, my office, and says, I'd like to deed my home to my son and daughter.
Yep.
Both or individually. What do we say to them right out of the gate, other than the obvious?
Well, again, that's easily done because that's just a deed going from the client to the client's children. And if that's what they really want, again, our job is to tell them the pros and cons of doing that. I mean, the cons would be if something bad happens to one of your kids, then your real estate is going to be subject to, you know, whatever bad thing is going on. And then number two, what about the income tax consequences of doing that? Again, the deed over to the child itself is not a taxable event, but the child is going to acquire the same tax basis that you have in the property or the client has in the property when you gift it to them or deed it to them during lifetime.
And that's the tax basis from when they purchased.
Purchased it plus improvements, yeah. So that may not be the smart thing to do. So we're always looking to find out, hey, client, what are you trying to accomplish? And then give them some of the pros and cons about, you know, doing something like that, or there's other techniques of you know, accomplishing maybe the same thing. Into
a trust, deeding it into a trust, and having the son or daughter or both direct beneficiaries.
Well, again, if the client's trying to avoid probate and still have full control over the house, then that technique, you know, may make some sense. So again, our job is to find out what's going on, what's the client trying to accomplish, and then we can give, you know, better advice. You know, we deal with asset protection trusts a lot. You know, again, they're not for everybody, but we try to find out, again, what's going on, what's important to them. If they're looking to still be in control, well, with an asset protection trust, you can. You know, but typically you have to give up something, and that's usually access to principal. So usually those asset protection trusts are set up so that the beneficiaries of the asset protection trust, you'd have two classes of beneficiaries. You'd have an income class of beneficiaries, and that can be the client, the elder, even though they're the trustee. The
current trustees.
So they may have a portfolio of mutual funds or stocks and bonds or even cash in the bank, and they want to still be able to get the interest or the dividends that are being generated from that. But they don't need to touch the principal because that's invested, that's in a CD, or that's in a, you know, a portfolio of mutual funds or stocks and bonds, and that's a great candidate for putting that type of an asset into an asset protection trust because the elder doesn't need to have direct access to the principal.
We have about 2 minutes left. God, this is such a voluminous subject. How about management? You touched on it a few times. The significance of the right fiduciary, other than yourselves, husband and wife, or an individual, a successor trustee, and the potential pitfalls. Well, we won't even go with pitfalls. The advantages of a son or a daughter being a trustee. A successor trustee.
First of all, the trustee is the person who manages the trust. Okay, and you can your trust is your rules as to how that's going to be managed. So usually the client is their own trustee during lifetime, and we'll have provisions that will say, hey, if the client, you know, dies or becomes incapacitated or wants to resign and doesn't want to be trustee anymore, then who would take over as trustee? I like, in general circumstances, for the other family members to take over as trustee. So if you're dealing with a married couple, you know, or a single individual, then we like to have their children taking over as trustee. Maybe one of their children, or maybe two of their children. Kind of depends on, you know, the family dynamics. Sometimes we run into situations where the children don't get along, but the parents still want to have the assets go equally to the children. Well, if they're not going to get along, and that could cause problems having one of them be trustee, or even two of them be trustee, if they're not going to be able to work together, then that would be a reason for having an independent person to be trustee, whether it be, you know, somebody's attorney or somebody's CPA or financial planner or bank trust department. That would be a good alternative for, you know, another person as opposed to a family member to be trustee.
And what's key is that independent party, whether it's someone like us, an attorney, we do this frequently, a bank, CPA, or what have you, they would have to adhere strictly to the tenets of the trust, the language of the trust, because it's a directive.
Correct.
It's an expression of the trustees, the client's wishes.
Right. The trustee's duty is to carry out the fiduciary responsibilities of the trust document. And that's typically to benefit the beneficiaries, depending on how the client has had that set up.
Well, Paul, we've gone through another 30 minutes. Quickly.
That was quick.
I know.
Too quick.
Once again, Paul and I want to thank you for tuning in. And again, we'd like you to look at the credits at the end of the show for contact information to talk to either one of us independently of this show. Email us, call us, and please sign up for one of the workshops. We'd love to have you at the workshop, and see you next time.